Thank you very much, Brother Howard, for reading that text for us this morning. And again, thank you for being here. We're honored to have you with us today. It's great to see Daniel Martin back from a recent mission trip to India. And I hope that we get to hear more about his trip. And we appreciate the great work that Daniel does on that annual trip and look forward to learning more from him. Have you ever received a letter from somebody that meant more to you than you can explain to anybody else? Maybe it's from somebody that you've known all of your life, somebody you cared about, somebody who you looked up to and respected, and you got a letter from them and it just meant so much to you. Maybe you've gotten a letter from some employer that you've had in your past, and maybe it was a letter of commendation. Maybe you've gotten a letter that was so meaningful to you that you hung it on your wall, that you made a plaque out of it. Maybe you've received cards and notes from people that meant a great deal to you. I was blessed this past week or so ago by receiving a box full of cards that were written by the ladies in this church about Laura, memories that they had of her. And I just want to say thank you for that. I went through and I read through it one time and cried about it with every one of them. And then I read through it again and I cried some more. And I said, I got to quit reading through this because it's making me cry a lot. But I want to thank you, ladies, for doing that. It's something that I will cherish for the rest of my life. And my children, my family will cherish it as well. And so thank you for your sentiments and your thoughts. They meant a great deal, the memories that you shared about her. And so sometimes we receive those kind of that kind of correspondence from people, and it helps us, it encourages us, it makes us want to do better, it makes us want to keep living for God and keep moving on in our life. Can you imagine what it would be like to receive a letter from Jesus? If you truly love Jesus, if you care about Him with all of your heart, if you want to follow Him, if your goal is to be more like Him, can you imagine receiving a letter from Him? Well, there were some churches back in the first century who received letters from Him. We say sometimes the 7 churches of Asia. I believe that those 7 churches that were in Asia really are representative of all churches around the world. And so what He was saying to them, He was saying to all of us. And one of those letters was to a church in a city by the name of Laodicea. I want to tell you a little bit about Laodicea. I wrote down a few thoughts here. Laodicea was an extraordinarily wealthy place. Years before this letter was written, it had been burned to the ground, and it had been rebuilt from scratch by one of the wealthiest families in the Roman Empire. Think about a city like Dubai in our world today, a city that's built from scratch just by an influx of money. It was a city that was an important textile center. They produced fine black wool that came from a rare breed of sheep that lived in the mountains surrounding Laodicea. And rich people came to Laodicea to buy the material that they made there because it was the finest material made in the world at that time. One writer I read said it was like the anthropology of their day. If you don't know anthropology, you might say Neiman Marcus or somewhere like that. It was the most valuable material that you could buy. Finally, it was a medical center of the Roman Empire. It was surrounded by mountains. The mountains contained a lot of hot mineral springs that people believed brought about healing qualities. And so Laodicea became a medical center. And a number of legitimate medical cures were developed there. Essential oils were found there and other things like that. And people came from all over the world to Laodicea who had illnesses because they believed that they could be cured there. Also, there was a church that was established in Laodicea, probably an outgrowth of some of Paul's missionary journeys. As a matter of fact, Paul wrote a letter to the church at Laodicea. We know that from Colossians chapter 4. The Bible says that Paul told the Colossians, I want you to, when you're through with this letter, I want you to pass it on to Laodicea. There was another city in the region called Hierapolis, and Paul wrote a letter to Hierapolis also. And so there were a lot of churches in this area. And it's interesting that Jesus chose to write a letter to this particular church instead of all the others. By the way, that letter that Paul wrote to Laodicea, we don't know anything about that letter. It was lost, but Paul said, I want you to send this letter that I'm writing to Colossae, I want you to send it to the Laodiceans, and I want you to read the letter that I wrote to them. These were both a part of what we call the circular letters. They were passed around. Paul would write a letter to a church, and they would read it in their assembly, and then they would pass it along to another church. And so this church was there, and Jesus wrote a letter to this church. And Jesus described himself in this letter to this church as the one who was the beginning of the creation of God. And so he was suggesting to them and reminding them that he had been around since the creation. He also called himself the Amen. The Amen, particularly in this particular translation, means the final word. This is the end of all things. He called himself the faithful and true witness. And it's interesting that he's writing to these people who were living in a world where there was a lot of falsehood. They are kind of originated false news, fake news. Well, he said, I am the faithful and true witness. Everything that I say, you can mark it down that it will be right. Now, look, a lot of times we say things that are not always true. Sometimes we may mean to do that. Other times we may not mean to do that. A lot of times, I know this is going to be difficult for you to believe, but sometimes preachers say things that are not true. Sometimes they make up stories that really didn't happen. I've just heard that a lot, that happens. But you can know that when Jesus says something, it is always true, because Jesus is the faithful and true witness. Everything that he says is always true and always right. And so Jesus writes this letter to this church. And in this letter, he says a number of things. Well, one of the things he says to them is that I know your deeds, that you're neither cold nor hot. It's interesting how Jesus used wording that these people would understand. He used language that they would understand. So, for instance, 6 miles southeast of Laodicea was the mountainous region of Hierapolis. The mountainous area of Hierapolis contained boiling mineral springs that were believed to have healing power. They were hot springs. And the people believed that if you could get in contact with these boiling hot springs, that it would cure you of anything that you had. That was 6 miles southeast. 6 miles northwest of Laodicea were the tall mountains of Colossae. Out of the mountains of Colossae flowed streams of ice-cold water that came from the melting snow. And so in one area, you had the boiling hot springs flowing down from the mountain toward Laodicea. And in the other area, you had the cold, fresh spring water flowing down that they could drink. And these two kinds of streams flowed into pools outside the city of Laodicea. And they combined to become stagnant ponds of tepid water. The historians say they weren't hot enough to take a good bath in, and they weren't cold enough for you to drink. They were neither cold nor hot. And Jesus said to this church in Laodicea, you're just like the water that surrounds your city. You're not cold and you're not hot. And Jesus said, I wish you were cold or hot. If you were cold, you would be worth something. If you were hot, you would be worth something. But you're not cold or hot, and because you are lukewarm, you make me sick. Now, it would not be good to get a letter from Jesus and he says, you make me sick. Jesus was typically positive and upbeat and encouraging. And Jesus talked about good things about people. And he said good things about people. And Jesus built people up and he encouraged them. But he said to this church, there are not a lot of things in the world that make me sick, but a church that is lukewarm makes me want to throw up. That's what Jesus said. There's nothing distinctive about you. You're like the environment around you. You claim to flow or originate from me, but you feel and look more like the environment around you. Listen to that. You claim to originate from me, Jesus said, but you look more like and you feel more like the world than you do like me. Listen, church, we have a tremendous opportunity in our world, an opportunity to show people Jesus. And during this time of year particularly, what a wonderful blessing that we can say to the world, let me tell you about the true and faithful witness. Let me tell you about the one who made all things, who has been from the beginning. And what we don't need to do is, we don't need to refuse to look like the one from whom we originate. We need to do everything that we can to keep from looking more like the environment in which we live, and we need to look and feel and sound and taste and smell more like the Christ who is our King. Jesus said to these people, you say I'm rich and you've become wealthy, he said, and need nothing. I mentioned to you that this was a wealthy city. The Laodiceans were known for being an extremely wealthy place. There was an earthquake that occurred, history tells us, in the year AD 61, not too long before this letter was written, not too many years before this letter was written. And it measured 8+ on the Richter scale. Every city in the region was destroyed, and the Roman government made available federal funds that were granted to every city so that they could rebuild. And the Laodiceans refused to take the money. They said, we can handle it ourselves. We've got this. And my first question is, has that ever happened in the history of the world? A city turning down money from the government. But they did that. But they were proud and they were self-sufficient, and the sense of self-sufficiency pervaded the church. And they thought, we're all right, we've got this. And they weren't people who cried out desperately for God, because they usually had everything under control. And they didn't even realize what Jesus said about them was that they were wretched and pitiful and poor and blind and naked. They were blind, he said. The Laodiceans had developed this eye salve that could cure a lot of vision ailments in those days. It was from these springs that surrounded the city that came from the Hierapolis. And they developed this eye salve. And the irony is that Jesus said, you need something that will cure your eye problem. And it's not a physical blindness or malady that they have, but a spiritual blindness. And one of the problems is that oftentimes we can see so much in our world, and we can see what is wrong in so many places. We have such great eyesight when it comes to our vision for purpose and meaning in the world, but we've lost our spiritual eyes. And Jesus said, you're naked. You're clothed. You clothe everyone around you with fine wool. But in my eyes, you're naked. Jesus said, I advise you to buy from me gold that is refined in the fire, so that you can be really wealthy, not fake kind of wealth. And then Jesus said in verse 20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. So why did Jesus respond to the city this way, the church this way? Why did Jesus say to the Laodiceans, who seemingly from the outside had it all together? I mean, if you came and visited the church at Laodicea, you would say, look at this. This is a great church. They're financially well off. They're doing well. They're a light to the community. And Jesus said, you make me sick. And why is it that he had this visceral kind of response? I believe two things. Number one is because of the way that they were living was a disrespectful response to grace. After who he claimed to be and what he did, only two responses seem appropriate and make sense when it comes to Jesus. You're either going to worship Him and serve Him with all of your being, or you're going to mock Him. You're going to refuse to be obedient to Him. You're going to refuse to follow Him. Have you noticed that people in the New Testament were never bored with Jesus? They were never bored with Him. I mean, they either fell in love with Christ and they served Him with everything that they had, or they hated Him and they tried to murder Him. Nobody was bored with Christ. And one of the problems, I believe, that in the church today, in the American church, is that we have become bored with Jesus. We seem to think that Jesus isn't enough, that we need more, that we've got to do something else, that we've got to find something else, that we've got to find meaning. And what this causes people to do a lot of times is this causes people to jump from church to church to church and from religion to religion to religion, because they're always looking for something when all the time Jesus can be right there for them. And when we quit looking for Christ and we look for what we need from Christ in others, we will always fail and we'll always be empty. And we'll never have the meaning in our life that He wants us to have. And the reason that Jesus was made sick by this church is because they were disrespectful to grace. Can you imagine somebody coming to your door and saying to you, just imagine this time of year, what if somebody walked to your door this week as you're thinking of Christmas and buying gifts and watching your budget, and are we going to be able to handle it all this year? What if somebody came and they said, I have paid off your debt. I've paid off your home. You don't have a mortgage anymore. I've paid off all your vehicles. I've paid off all of your credit cards. You don't have to pay anything else. Would you treat that fellow like he had just bought you a postage stamp? Well, of course not. There'd be no end to your appreciation. There would be no way for us to say thank you enough. And one of the problems with the church at Laodicea, and oftentimes with churches in America, in the world today, is that we have forgotten how to say thank you to Jesus for all that He's done for us. The second reason I think that it makes Jesus sick is because it tells the world a lie about Him. Somebody wrote the single biggest cause of atheism are people who claim to know God but are not distinct in any way from the world. There are people who claim to know God, but there's nothing distinctive about them. People who say that they're Christians, who go to church and who are even active sometimes in the church, but Jesus doesn't really make any difference in their lives. And Jesus said, that makes me sick when I see people who are my followers giving a lie to the world. It tells the world that Jesus is not enough, that I need something more. And if we do not recapture the sacrificial spirit, the love for Christ that was found in the early Christians, we will lose our authenticity. And we will lose the ability to influence people for Christ. And so what does a lukewarm church look like? What do we look like if we're not all out for Christ? Just two or three thoughts here. Number one, lukewarm Christians put people above the Lord. We are so concerned about our relationships, about our jobs, about the people that we work with and the people that we work for, and we crave acceptance by people more than we do God. We're people who crave the approval of others. I mean, why don't we take a selfie and put it on the internet for everybody to see, and the first thing we do is see how many likes it got after we like it ourselves, you know. We crave attention. We crave acceptance. We don't want to be regarded as strange, and so we conform to the morals of everybody around us. Listen, we cannot put people above Jesus. We must love people. We must encourage others. We must build relationships, but those relationships must never be above Christ. Second thing is, lukewarm Christians rarely talk about Jesus. They don't share their faith. They consider themselves to be Christians, but they're uncomfortable in telling other people. One of the characteristics of the New Testament church is they went everywhere preaching the word, the Bible says. I don't believe that means literally that everywhere they stood out on the street corner and preached a sermon, but it does mean that everywhere they went, they talked to people about Christ. They told people about Jesus. Young people, you ever talk to friends at school about Jesus? You ever spend time sharing your faith with them, letting them know what Jesus means to you? Do you talk to people that you work with about Christ? We talk about everything in the world. We talk about, some people talk about their grandchildren all the time. It's just sickening, isn't it? But do we talk to people about Jesus? Lukewarm Christians rarely share their faith. Number 3, lukewarm Christians rationalize their sin. They think that their sin is all right. And we rationalize it like this: I'm not as bad as the person that lives next door to me. Or, I'm not as bad as I used to be. I've gotten better. And we try to rationalize away our sin. So we're constantly asking, how close can I come to sin without being thought of as a bad person? When we ask that, we're really showing that we're not moved by the love of Christ. If you love your wife, men, you take her out on a date, you're not, and you really want to show your love to her, you're not going to spend the least amount of money you can. I mean, surely if you love your wife and it's your big anniversary, surely you're not going to take her to McDonald's. Surely you wouldn't take Whataburger, would you? Larry, would you? Surely. And if we love Jesus, surely we try to do the very least that we can do for Him. Number 4, lukewarm Christians think more about the earth than they do about eternity. They focus on the here and now. Everything in their life is centered around, what can I get out of this life, and where am I headed in this life? And a person who is completely committed to Jesus Christ will not focus on the here and now. We'll spend more time thinking about the there and then than we do the here and now. Someday, what you see around you will not be here. Someday, even the people that we see around us will not be here. Someday, all of our relationships will be changed. Everything that we have will be different. But Christ will always be the same. He is the same yesterday and today and forever. He will always be the same. Our attitude should not be, what can I get out of this life? But our attitude should always be, what can I do to make sure that I'm preparing myself for the next life? Number 5, lukewarm Christians only turn to God when they really need something, only in emergencies. I see it all the time. When a need brings somebody back to God, when they lose a job, or they go through a divorce, or their kids walk away from their faith, or they have a health concern, or they get fired from their work. And that's fine. All of that is good and well. But if your relationship with Jesus Christ is based upon only what you need at the moment, you'll never become anything more than a tepid Christian. Oh, you'll go to worship God. You may give some money to the church. You may be involved in some of the programs or ministries of the church. But until your love for Christ becomes supreme and you show your need for Him all the time, I want to plead with you today, church. Don't talk to Christ. Don't come to Christ only during times of emergency. But be willing to come to Him at all times. Jesus said, You can come before the throne of grace with boldness at any time. You can come through me to the Father at any time. The time that He gets us out of trouble, we thank Him and then we move on until the next time that we need Him. But a Christian who is on fire for God, a Christian who is sharing his faith, a Christian who is communicating what he believes about Christ to the world, that kind of Christian will see his need for Jesus in his life every hour of every day. But it is true, sometimes life hits us square in the face and we get a dose of reality. And we remember how we cannot survive without Him. And then last, lukewarm Christians are not much different than the rest of the world. Remember we talked about that water in Laodicea was neither hot like the springs in the south, nor was it cold like the springs in the north. It was indistinct. It was lukewarm. It was room temperature. And Jesus says lukewarm Christians are like that in relation to the world around them. They look the same as everybody else. They act the same as everybody else. They go to the same places as everybody else. They watch the same kinds of things on television or on the big screen as everybody else in the world. They talk like everybody else in the world. There's nothing distinctive about them. Jesus doesn't call upon us to be weird, to be different in a weird kind of way. But He does call upon us to not look like and act like everybody else in the world. If we are all the same, if every child of God acts like every person who doesn't know Christ, what purpose do we serve? Why are we here? What is our mission? And our mission and our purpose in this life is to glorify God and to help other people find Christ. And how are we going to do that? It is not by being just like everybody else around us. It is by being distinctive in the way that we act, in the way that we live, the way that we talk, and the things that we do. It's about being distinctive in the way that we treat our wives and our husbands and our children, and the way that we put our life into the work that we do. It's about being distinctive in how we relate to others. But if you want to be a lukewarm Christian, just blend in with the rest of the world. See, the problem with the waters around Laodicea was they had become lukewarm. They weren't hot, they weren't cold. They were just lukewarm. And Jesus said to that church, your problem is that you're just like your environment. You're no different. And Jesus calls us, listen, He calls us to be distinct. He calls us not to look like the environment, not to live like the rest of the world. He calls us to be different. There's something different about a person who is truly following Christ. There's something different about the decisions that they make and the choices that they make and the things that they do and the places that they go and how they treat others and how they show concern for people who have needs. There's something different about a Christian. Jesus says, don't look like everybody else around you. And don't get your cues about how to live in this world from society. Some Christians, even in matters of religion, in matters of faith, they want to read the latest book, and whatever the last book that they read, that's what they want to be. The last person that they heard speak that made an impression on them, that's what they want to be. And Jesus says, don't get your cues from people in the world. Get them from me. And so in the season when people are turning to see Christ, you know, and I know, we know that they're not going to see Christ in the typical person walking down the street. And they're not going to see Jesus appear in the flesh. If they see Christ, it will be through you and through me. They'll see Him through the way that we live and the way that we act and the things that we do and how we treat others, even one another. So the world is desperately looking for Christ. And the question is, will we give Christ to the world? Or will we blend in and be like the Laodiceans? We're going to take a moment here and encourage people who want to know Christ. And maybe there's somebody here today who's lost contact with your faith, and maybe you really never come to Christ and you've never given your all to Him. And he stands at the door. Jesus said in this verse, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart. And if you'll open the door, He says, "I'll come in and I will dine with you and we'll enjoy fellowship with one another." And if you will allow Jesus into your life, if you will open the door of your heart and allow Him in, it will change everything about you. And so He calls upon you to come. So today we encourage you, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, if you believe He can make your life different, if you will turn your life completely over to Him, give it all to Him, if you will confess your faith in Him, and if you will be buried with Christ in baptism, you will be united with Him, you will become one with Him, and He will live with you and in you for the rest of your life. And we hope you'll consider that today. And if you're a Christian, listen please carefully. If you're a Christian and you've become lukewarm, if there's nothing distinctive about the way that you live your life, if you're just like the world around you and everybody else, and you just blend it in, won't you make a commitment today to become something different? To become more like Christ? And to say to the world who's looking for Jesus, you can see Him now. Not in a prideful, arrogant kind of way. You can see Him through the kind of life that we live. And maybe you need to make that commitment, and it's a private thing, but maybe the church can pray for you. Maybe we can help you. If you have any needs, we're going to take this moment to invite you to come to Him while we stand together and while we sing.